Hit the recording. Isaac, you're going to kick us off because then we'll be taking over after that.
Perfect. All right, everyone. Welcome. As you just heard, we just started the recording. The session is being recorded. Welcome to Coaching Agile Journeys / OLN event, Open Leadership Network. We're so glad that you're joining us today. This is an opportunity for us as two great communities to come together and hear some wonderful content. So I'm so glad that you're here. We have some great speakers and wonderful content lined up for you today. The recording will be available on coachingagilejourneys.com once we get it up there. And if you have any questions during the presentation, you can put them in the chat and we'll be getting to them as we go forward. But we're talking today about a very important topic, which is decision making for your Agile teams. And so I know that you came probably, some of you wondering what the topic was about, but more likely you came saying, yes, how do I help my teams make better decisions, get more rich outcomes out of it? And so that's what we're gathered here today to learn from two phenomenal speakers that it's absolutely my pleasure to introduce. Both Cristin and Heidi have been friends of mine and partners with Coaching Agile Journeys and Open Leadership Network for a long time. They are both wonderful coaches. And so we'll give the mic over to them and hear what they have to say. I'm looking forward to it, ladies. So take it away for us. Thank you so much for doing this session.
Thanks, Isaac.
Thanks, Isaac.
Yeah, so as we get started, and before I start sharing my screen, I'd like you to consider what made you show up today and maybe any pending decisions that you've got going, or perhaps a decision that didn't go so well in your organization that you're now thinking about, or even one that went very well. And consider, we're going to walk through some things today, why things might go well or not go well. So I am going to share my screen and get us going. Hopefully you can see the correct screen here.
Yep.
And awesome. Slide everybody around. So this is, as Isaac said, a joint session. So we'd love to know where you're from and what made you show up today. So please feel free to share that in the chat. We love to hear from our guests. And decision making, just to cue us up, right, and get us going, is the process of making choices by identifying decision, gathering information, and assessing alternate resolutions. And why am I here? Why do I care? What spurred us to do this talk? So I've been through 8 Agile transitions from the inside as a full-time employee or a full-time contractor, from team member to directing a transformation. Each of them struggled in many of the same ways, though. As a consultant now, I've been seeing all the same patterns with clients. Most people are unhappy and not engaged in their work. And it's really hard to grow autonomy in a command and control organization, and of course, impossible to do great work. And we know that autonomy is key for the future of work and the decisions that we have to make. So we must grow autonomy, make good decisions as we move forward. I'm a co-founder and advisory board member of the OLN. Open leadership ideas I found them pragmatic ways to encourage and increase both autonomous behavior and teamwork in organizations. And making better decisions is the key to organizational transformations. As we were talking about the OLN mission and vision and the open patterns over these past few weeks in the advisory board, it came down to decision making, right? Everything comes down to that. If you can't do that well, then you're not really going to get anywhere. And bad decisions or slow decisions, of course, are rampant in organizations today. And I am out to change this. I am going to pass it over to Cristin.
Thanks, Heidi. So like Heidi, I have been involved in 3 Agile transformations and 1 Agile evolution. So I want to take a second to explain the difference, at least in my eyes. The transformations were waterfall organizations that needed to shift to an Agile way of doing things. So that included mindset, practices, and processes. You can imagine there's all sorts of literature, and you've probably participated in something like that. The Agile evolution came about when I joined an organization that was pretty late stage startup in hyper growth. They had a great Agile culture, if not some mature practices and processes. And they were trying to figure out how to scale while preserving and evolving that Agile culture. That's a completely different ballgame from a transformation from waterfall to Agile. And I do think that is where we're going, right? I think the world is sort of headed in that direction. So it's been an absolute joy to experience it. I also believe Agile is about resilience. So I think over the years, we've gotten really hung up on practices and processes, and that's how you're Agile. But in fact, it's really about the adaptability, the trust, the scalability, but also sustainability. And ultimately, it means when a pandemic comes, we can respond rather than knee-jerk react. And I am also a huge believer in high-performing teams throughout the organization. I think a lot of companies have a tendency to sort of like focus on teams at the lowest level of the organization. And then as we grow, we don't behave as teams. And the lower levels of the organization reflect the teams that they see in the upper level. So it just makes the whole thing harder. So I really focus on that in the engagements that I'm involved in. And then the last thing that I'll say is related to Open Leadership Network. And what really resonated for me when I first learned about it was that it equally values the organizations and the humans, right? It recognizes that we have to care for both in order for both to thrive. And it's really consumable information that anybody could use. So I'm really excited to be part of this talk today.
Great.
All right, so let's talk about decisions. So Plato had this great quote thousands of years ago: good decision is based on knowledge, not on numbers, right? So he couldn't have imagined, probably, wicked smart guy, but probably couldn't have imagined the amount of quantitative data we would have at our fingertips today. But still, he's right? So what did he mean by knowledge? I think he meant contextual understanding. So Heidi, if you want to go to the next. Awesome, thank you. So contextual understanding includes the data, right? The numbers, all that great quantitative stuff that we get, but it also includes the system in which you're trying to make this decision, right? There's incentives and pressures, both internal and external. Those are going to have a big impact, right? The levels of trust. So if you're in a low trust organization, it's entirely plausible that all the information you need hasn't actually surfaced because people are afraid to surface it. And also the different ways people make sense of things. So some people are really driven to, sort of have a checklist. They feel good at the end of the day when they've checked all their boxes. And other people are really analytical and they want to ruminate for a little bit on things, right? Those different players in a decision are going to have completely different outcomes and results, whether it's an individual decision or a group decision. And then, of course, there's the traps that we fall into because we're human and we're not rational and we bring emotion to everything that we do as much as we would like to not do. So let's talk a little bit more about the traps, Heidi.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you pointed out that we're really not rational beings, much as we like to think we are. So one of the traps that you could fall into would be like this or that, narrow framing it's called. So we're limiting our decision to two choices falsely when there are many more options out there. We just haven't expanded our brain enough. So some telltale signs for this trap might be hearing the words whether or not and yes or no, or this or that kind of thing. So yeah, there's a fun story about folks at Google who were allowed to work on competing theories for the same outcome to see which one is better. And that's an example of just trying to get outside of your narrow framing.
Yep. And then anchoring, right? That's when we gravitate towards the first option that we see. So it's like we have this spotlight and we're sort of panning around looking for options. And the first one the spotlight lands on gets stuck there and it can't seem to move off of there. Yeah. What about the next one, Heidi?
Yeah, so overconfidence. Oh, a bias towards believing we can predict the future while forgetting the challenges that we usually have or what we had to adjust along the way in previous examples of that. I'm sure that resonates with folks.
Yeah, and sunk cost. I'm sure we've never heard of sunk cost before having an impact on our decisions. This is when there's a heavier weight given to the time, money, or effort that's been spent on something. So we pay too much attention to, yeah, but we already spent $2 million on this thing, and not enough attention to, yeah, but we could save $2 million if we stopped now, right?
Yeah, in a previous organization, they worked 2 years on software with multiple teams, like 5 teams, and there were danger signs along the way that this new rewrite wouldn't work either, but they decided to release it anyway under intense pressure by investors and internal leadership. And of course, they released it. It was so bad, they had to pull it back and decommission it. And I'm not talking about SaaS software. I'm talking about this was installed like on-premise software. So it really was a huge miss. So then there's the other one is status quo, a bias towards options that are similar to the ones maybe you've made before, or similar to the current situation. So not looking further and outside of this area that what we're doing right now, what we've done recently in the past, which is of course often hard to think outside the box when we're so rushed under time and pressure.
Yeah. And fear of the unknown is a huge driver of the status quo trap. Yeah. Confirmation bias. This one is such a sticky wicket because this happens when you're trying to do your due diligence, right? To like find your best options, surface all your information. But we're humans, and confirmation bias means we gravitate towards the information that supports our belief, right? How can you police yourself, right? That's a really hard thing.
Yeah. I worked at a place that did spend like $100 million over this by listening to friendly customers. Like to your point, they were trying to do the right thing and listen and get customers involved early, but they only listened to those friendly voices that were saying positive things, and the concerns about other customers who decided not to use the product and pilot, they just avoided those at all. So yeah.
Yeah, and I worked at an organization also where the product manager got opportunities to the development team by way of the tech lead, right? So they'd take sort of a one pager, hand it off to the tech lead, and then that person would go off in their corner and come up with the best design because they knew all the things, right? They decided on everything. And that was aimed at efficiency, right? Which is a huge driver for some of these traps. But when we sat here and created this list of traps, I thought, now how many of those could that person have fallen into, right? And really the answer is all of them, right? Anybody who goes off into a corner to make decisions is really prone to falling into any one of or more than one of those traps. So
Definitely.
yeah, very dangerous.
Yeah, thank you. So right now we're going to queue up, and just for 2 minutes, we're going to brainstorm and reflect on a recent decision. Was it a good decision that you made in your team or your wider group? And how do you know it was a good decision? And then perhaps now that you've been introduced to some of these traps, what decision-making traps might you have fallen into? So I'll just queue up my timer for a couple minutes, and then we'll move on.
Yep.
So 2
And
minutes.
we're going to come back to this in a couple of minutes. So like towards the end of the talk. So if you want to write it down on a piece of paper or drop it in a notepad or something, we want to reflect on this later.
Yep. About 40 seconds left. Five seconds. Just like a teacher, get ready to put your pencils down. Cool. So if you can type in the chat, or you can unmute and share something with us. Did anything come up for you?
I'll jump in, Heidi. I know people are probably putting things in the chat, but I'll say that thinking about a recent one, as I went through these and as you've described them, I saw almost all of them reinforcing one another in a recent decision that we made. And so it's interesting that you've called them out, because I see them. I can now say, oh, that was there. Oh, that was there. That was there. And so I'm looking forward to, hopefully you have some recommendations to
Great.
maybe overcome that. But
Awesome.
I see them, almost all of them.
Great. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, we were wondering whether some of these things, then examples would resonate. So someone else posted in the chat, we encountered narrow framing and anchoring when seeking resources with limited funds. Great. Thanks. Anyone else?
Yeah, I was going to say that sometimes overconfidence can be confused with optimism. I have a tendency to be overly optimistic, and you know, maybe there's a little overconfidence in there that I was a little blind to.
Oh, great. Thanks for sharing, Lori. Awesome. So keep thinking about those decisions, because we're going to touch on them again as we go through this this presentation. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Heidi.
Mm-hmm.
So my apologies. So there's a lot of guidance out there, actually. If you start looking for decision-making traps, there's tons of guidance on how to handle that. Two of the really key elements that come through in almost all of them are include different perspectives and be clear about your objectives and boundaries. And they include different perspectives. Like, everybody's like, yeah, of course you would. Why wouldn't you do that? But when we get really busy and we start focusing on efficiency and resource utilization and things like that, this very readily falls by the wayside for a lot of organizations. The objectives and boundaries for teams, a lot of times, I think people just assume it's going to take care of itself, right? Everybody knows what we need to decide. Everybody knows like the boundaries around making those decisions. And in fact, that isn't the case. So what we're looking to do today is share with you a couple of patterns. They're open leadership patterns, but they speak directly to these behavioral patterns, which are given as guidance to avoid those traps that we talked about. So Heidi's going to share a little bit more here in a second on patterns.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things that, just before we move on, I wanted to share is you kind of alluded to it, is like including different perspectives. And I often find, especially at senior leadership levels, they either come into an organization wanting to make an impact right away. And so they want to own this huge decision, maybe about a reorg or some restructure, some major decision that wants to take place. And they're trying to make it when they have the least information. And they haven't included different perspectives. And I've just seen this over and over again. So including different perspectives also means it takes a little bit longer. And so then there's this sort of bias toward action that leadership, especially leadership teams, have, where they like, well, I'd like to include everybody's opinion, but we just don't have time. So we're going to move fast. We have to move fast. And so what we're going to do is introduce some other techniques that they can still move fast and make good decisions. So thanks, Kristen. The two patterns we're going to talk about today are boundary management and whole group process. There are 8 patterns, as you can see on this wheel. You can feel free to go to openleadershipnetwork.com/patterns if you want to know about more of these. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. So let me back up and share, like, where did these come from? In early 2019, Daniel Mezek approached me about creating the OLN, and I saw some of his initial work, and I actually stopped the book I was writing for team level Agile coaches because I thought the book needed to be rewritten around the patterns. I told him I think the patterns are going to turn out to be super important. I want to align the book with the patterns. Soon after, I partnered with Kristen on a workshop to make these small bets about the book and the patterns. And a long story short, the book's still not written, but we still do plan to write one. The open leadership patterns, as we kind of mentioned earlier, struck me as easy to understand and consume. This was something that I could take to HR departments who were struggling to have people understand what the issues that the organization was facing, right? Like explicit agreement. Oh, we don't have explicit agreement. Oh, we don't know what our boundaries are, especially on team boundaries. And oh, we just make decisions in silos. So that's what really stood out for me about these patterns. But why do I think that patterns themselves are so impactful? Patterns are everywhere, actually, but we're all familiar. Oh, sorry. We're all familiar with the Agile Manifesto principles, but they're so vague that some people, especially those new to Agile, have trouble understanding how to implement them or what they actually mean. And so that's not to detract from them at all, but I find a huge gap between understanding of principles and the things that people actually do in their day-to-day, right? It's hard to remember those principles and adhere to them all the time. But patterns, we just don't call them that, but there are entire conferences on them, and people are tuned to detect patterns for survival. So Scrum has patterns as an example. One of them is called yesterday's weather. I'm sure when I say what it is, it'll resonate with you. It's basically use the previous sprint's velocity as the best indicator of the next sprint's velocity, because people tend to set increasingly high goals for themselves to the point of not being able to achieve them. So that is the yesterday's weather pattern. And there are design patterns in Java, of course. There are patterns in chess and everywhere. So feel free to type in the chat. We'd love to know, where else have you found patterns that we don't really think about or talk about in our day-to-day lives? So I'm not really sure why patterns haven't taken off as much as principles, perhaps because they're in the Agile Manifesto. So once you know a pattern, first of all, people will expect this pattern and ask questions if it's missing. You'll find out more about that as we go through. And of course, you can easily spot anti-patterns. I've got lots of examples about when senior leadership is involved in silos, like I talked about before. But if our expectation is that we involve others in decisions before making a big decision that impacts them, then when that pattern is missing, people are going to say, hey, wait, something's wrong, right? What's going on here? Let's not do it this way. So where do patterns fall into this mix? There are principles, of course, which are rules which govern our behavior. And the behavior is just the way that someone behaves or acts generally. A pattern is a model or example that you could follow. Think of a knitting pattern or a sewing pattern, right? You're doing it yourself, but you have this model to follow. They're one level deeper than principles, where you can kind of understand it enough to build more easily on them. And of course, a practice is the actual application of something, like the 3 questions in the daily Scrum. So a principle above yesterday's weather might be agile processes promote sustainable development. The sponsors, developers, and users should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. So now you can kind of see this link. One other example of a principle and pattern, when you're thinking about the most efficient and effective method of conveying information is face-to-face conversation within a development team. Okay, that's great. I know I need to talk face-to-face, but it doesn't tell you how you might do this or when you might do it. So you might just talk to the product owner or Scrum Master. In the open leadership, we learned that involving the entire team in some way is important. So this is just one level deeper. And if you were to go to the Scrum Guide, of course, you'd find out that the events like the daily Scrum and retrospectives call for the whole team to be involved in what they should be doing with that time. So I hope this makes sense. You'll actually find lots of the open patterns as part of the Scrum Guide, which has actually really done a really great job both of defining decision-making constraints and boundaries, and has some patterns there. Sorry for the background noise. It's
timing.
The guy with the blower, yeah.
Yeah. So Heidi talked about patterns. I'm going to talk a little bit more about them, and then we have this sort of little graphic that we want to engage people on in the chat. So what we're talking about today is patterns that we want to be intentional about, right? So we had a couple people in the chat talk about coding patterns. That's intentional, right? New relationship patterns. Sometimes that's not intentional, right? As human beings, we start to follow patterns naturally. Think about meetings that you might have joined. There's a recurring weekly meeting. It's supposed to be this collaborative kind of thing. It's fallen into a status pattern and you're not getting much value out of it. You go into it expecting it to be that way, right? So we are designed as human beings, right, to see these patterns. So when we're intentional about using them in our team or our organization, we can have a huge impact. So having said all of that and talking about all the traps, something that we thought might be interesting is to reflect on your organization or your team and figure out what patterns are you following, maybe not as intentionally. So if you're following A, you could put A in the chat, which is limiting the people involved. Are you really focused on efficiency? So you're limiting people. Or B, do most decisions get escalated up the chain of command, right? C, everything requires consensus, which is generally pretty slow and often not the best result in the end. Or D, you delay hard decisions. We keep kicking that can down the road and we experience pain every time we kick it, but we don't actually make a final decision. Yeah, we're getting lots of good ones.
A, C, C, B, depends. Yeah, great. Is this chart kind of resonating with you folks? Please. Cool.
Cool. So the first pattern, Heidi introduced them a little while ago, but we're going to get into this a little bit more. So boundary management. So when we talked about the two behaviors that sort of combat the traps, one of them we said was to be clear about objectives and boundaries. So boundary management is a pattern where we get explicit about our boundaries. We make sure that they're not so tightly designed that they prevent self-organization or autonomy. We carefully maintain them, and we think about tasks and time and territory. It's basically the rules of the game. So if you think about going to a match, a sporting match or game, the players on the field are really clear on what the rules are, and that's what allows them to play the game. It might look different each time, but everybody's tuned into those rules, and so are the spectators. It's actually much more fun when you know the rules as a spectator, right? That plays out in business as well. So we can be really intentional about that and actually use it to help us get better outcomes.
That's great. So it also occurs to me when I'm hearing you chat is that when people in every single organization I've ever been in walk around like, hey, I'm not sure, what does Cristin do around here, you know? But it's really less about what Cristin does and more about the decisions that Cristin can make, you know? So just think about that. And I'm just curious whether that resonates with you as well in your experience.
Yep. Okay, so then how do we use the boundary management to help us with decision making? So when you're like, if you think about the example that you were conjuring up earlier when you were reflecting, was everybody clear on the decision to be made and who gets to decide? A lot of times it's just not explicit, and there are multiple people who think they actually play that role, which can slow everything down. Who gets to provide input? Who can turn over the decision? Imagine if that's not explicit, what that can do to trust if that decision gets overturned, right? And how will we decide, right? If we want to do a survey for everybody to gather their input, we should clarify how we intend to use that input so people don't feel like they're just sending off information to a black hole and nobody used it, because the next time you send a survey, they're probably not going to respond. And then getting really clear on our guardrails, like budget and timelines and scope and those kinds of things. The high stakes decisions, you want to make sure you hit all of these bullets. The lower stakes decisions, maybe not, maybe you can be a little bit more flexible in them, but be thinking about these things. And if you get your team to recognize this pattern as the normal way of doing business to make decisions, if you miss a step and they are not clear on something, they help perpetuate the use of the pattern, right? So then it's not just about you. I did work with a group where we had multiple teams who owned a service, so shared ownership of a service, which was a little scary anyway. It was a hard decision to make to figure out who owned the service. So a bunch of them owned the service, and a bug came along and they needed to fix the bug. And everybody was really excited to collaborate and get it done. And, you know, everybody's chugging away, getting it done. And then they hit a point where they needed to make a decision. They had a few options on the table. Nobody was really sure who got to decide. So what ensued was a couple weeks worth of people sharing opinions and ideas and hoping one of them would sort of like bubble to the top as the favorite. That is no way to make a decision, right? So when I reflect on that, I think, wow, at the onset of this, had the team come together and agreed on who would decide if they hit some kind of decision, they could have hit that and then kept going, right? So
yeah.
Yeah.
I have an example. It's actually I have a couple hiring examples, but the one I'll use today is this. So a team was interviewing a developer, and they had been told that they get to decide. And so what happened is they interviewed someone and they said no. And then the manager says, well, I don't care. I'm going to hire that person anyway. So how long do you think that person actually lasted in the organization and the team? they were gone in 90 days. Like nobody had bought into it, right? So it was like extreme. In both cases of my hiring misses, it was where someone overruled the decision after they were told that the team could own the decision, and just created a huge lack of engagement. So if you go in with set expectations that might happen, and those guardrails, and you can have a productive dialogue around it at least. Okay. So the whole idea about whole group process, the pattern of whole group process in open leadership, is that we need to include different perspectives today more than ever, right? We need these whole group process over closed door dialogue and siloed decision making. We need to validate assumptions, gauge overall group readiness, and then obtain these org level alignments before we proceed. Why is this important? Among those other things, right? Diversity of thought. Even no single person knows everything, even an expert, exactly because of those biases that we might, and traps that we might fall into. So as an example, a startup grew, and they used to involve everybody, but they grew so big, they just decided they couldn't keep doing that anymore. And so that what they decided to do is to go with one qualified specialist to make decisions. And so when I shared this idea of why that might not be a good idea, they realized they could still pick an intentionally small, diverse group that of the most appropriate people for that decision, and then specifically ask them to focus on both positive and negative scenarios, like red teaming, if you were attended our last one of our talks in November. So in this example, picking one person to make a decision is an anti-pattern. So I hope it can begin to resonate. Like if your brain is geared towards patterns like whole group process, then you can now say, oh, one person, that's an anti-pattern. So it's not that a whole group needs to be in the room for every micro decision. That's why in a team setting, making things explicit and then the common shared understanding of what's going on is so key. And so when you put it all together, hopefully you can see this complex interplay of knowledge, decision-making, and boundaries being so key. And the more global, foundational, or directional a decision is, the more you would want to make sure it's a good decision, right? And so you might want to include more perspectives and more people, and then also consider how to de-risk it, right? Could you just do a smaller org change? Could you do it iteratively and get feedback, see how it works? And there are ways to involve 100 people or more quickly, right? You could start somewhere like a survey, a structured open table dialogue, and things like that. So it doesn't have to be a heavy process to involve an entire group. And every time I introduce this, especially to executive leadership, it's like, oh no, I don't want design by committee, decision by committee. Oh no, consensus, that never works. Oh, it takes forever. Oh, it's going to be a free for all. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about whole group process. It's not about neither is about everyone always goes along with one person's opinion, or the most senior person or the loudest person wins, or the highest paid person wins. And I will say this is all about great facilitation skills to elicit everyone's ideas and opinions and keep things moving forward. And frankly, this is really hard, which is why there are so many meetings where no decisions are made. Like if there's one thing that you could take away aside from the patterns, is that facilitation skills are so key in meetings. I worked with a team where they had tried to meet 5 times to decide how to assign code reviews to their team, because they spanned across teams as a front-end shared service. Then I offered to facilitate a meeting, and they said, no, we've met 5 times already. We don't need you here. We still haven't been able to decide. And I said, okay, well, come back if you decide you want to have this dialogue. They came back a week later and said, yeah, we still can't decide. So when I met with them, it turned out all they needed was someone to introduce the idea of fist to 5 and thumb voting to get them to understand that no one was really opposed to the solution that they had talked about, but they felt that auto-assigning PRs by writing code to solve the problem wasn't really agile. So I asked them if they were willing to run an experiment and meet 1 month from then to talk about what they liked and what they didn't like about their process so far, and they agreed to this. And when we met again, they had a few comments, but in general, they felt it was working well. So it's often the simplest things that can help to move a decision forward from stagnation to action. Kristen, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. So we've included a list here. I'm going to talk through this list a second. And I would love, if you have other ideas, things you want to share, drop them in the chat. Basically, to pull this together, the 2 patterns, boundary management and whole group process, are patterns you can use to apply all the different practices and techniques and formats and frameworks that you're already using today, or that you might even learn about in the next 5 years or whatever it is, right? So from a framework standpoint, you can use open space technology, you can use lean coffee, right? Those are using whole group process. And then if you get explicit about the decision that you need to make, who needs to make it, all of those kinds of things, you can incorporate this pattern in the way you're doing those things to make better decisions. And then from a practices and techniques standpoint, something I found really interesting was in doing research for this talk, there's a lot of guidance out on the internet and in books and podcasts and whatever on better decision making. A lot of it is geared towards individual decision making, right? Questions you might ask yourself to shift the way you're looking at something. So what becomes really powerful here is you as a facilitator can pose that question to the group, right? So using that whole group process as your pattern, you can use any technique, right? So a couple that we shared, Heidi's going to talk a little bit more about fist to five. Do you want to explain that one a little bit, Heidi?
Yeah, in case someone here is not familiar with fist to five, it's really a structured decision-making technique to get folks to understand like degrees of decisions and degrees of alignment and misalignment. So like the fist means I'm blocking this, and then you would share why you're blocking it. And so the rest are just degrees of like, I have, reservations about it. And then you would share. And of course, five is like, it's the best decision ever. I wholeheartedly move ahead. And so understanding that people who, it's not just a yes or no, right? What can we do to move this decision forward? And then talk about that in a structured and helpful way instead, right? And then of course, the thumb voting, also known as Roman voting, just thumbs up, I don't care, or, thumbs down, let's move ahead. So those are the two techniques.
Yeah.
Jason has posted decider and resolution from core protocols, really effective as well.
Very cool. Very cool. And I recently just finished the book Decisive by Dan and Chip Heath. And one of the things they talked about was posing the question, what would have to be true for each of these options to be successful? And then also, excuse me, the replace or with and, right? So you're the voice in the room that interjects with that to get the group to start exploring the other options. And that is how you come up with a better decision using that pattern, right? Really powerful.
Yeah. Or remove all options, right? If we can't, suddenly we can't do what we thought we wanted to do, then what do we do now?
Yeah. Cool.
So reflect on your recent decision again, right? Do you see where your team might have fallen into some of these decision-making traps? We kind of talked about them as we go through. And now that you've been introduced to the idea of boundary management and whole group process and some of these techniques, do you think that might have improved the results somehow? And do you have an open or upcoming decision for which you think you might try boundary management and whole group process? And so, I'd love to hear from any of the audience what resonated with them, what you might want to share.
Feel free to come off mute if you'd like.
Yeah.
Or chat.
Here, someone's posting they did PI planning remotely and did fist to five. Yeah.
Quiet crowd today.
It is. Decision trees are underutilized. Oh, Jason, do you want to share about decision trees? Not to call you out, but just kind of call you out.
About shy. So when there's economic results and you can assess probability, you start talking about likelihoods. So if you remember decision trees from maybe high school or college, when you've given the two options, you say, well, it's a 50-50 chance this could happen. And there's two different possibilities of the outcomes. You can actually come up with the numerical assessment. Now, you don't have to agree with it. You can override the data, but given two choices, particularly like say, well, we have a belief that this is a feasible solution, making this for a development team. It's an equal probability it's feasible that we can do this. If it is successful, this will be the outcome. If it's not successful, this is what it will cost us. And you can get into opportunity cost assessments and then extend it even further. Well, if feasible? Is it viable in the marketplace? So as a product owner, you can assess, well, I think there's a 75% possibility that if it works, we can sell it, and 25% it won't. So you can actually come up with the different outcomes and measure them. It's pretty simple math.
Great. Thanks. Thanks for sharing. Anyone else want to share?
Does anybody have a decision coming up that that you came here hoping to get some help on and we want to talk about?
No. I see some thoughtful faces.
I know, right? A bunch of people looked up at the ceiling when I said that.
Yeah, cool.
Cool. So, oh, go ahead. Great.
I have a question. How did you overcome the management making a decision on hiring like a developer when the team thought no? Because we've got that happening and they don't last long.
Yeah. You actually have data, right? So that's actually a perfect point, because you now have data to share, like, okay, so the team said no to this, the manager said yes, and then these, whatever the amount of data you have, these 3 people have already left the team. And I don't think they've ever seen it that way. Like, if the team is going to be working with this person every day and they haven't even bought into that team member, it's the obvious thing that's going to happen that they will walk away. So I think conveying the impact, hiring a new person is very expensive. The team has to onboard this person. Do you really think that they're going to want to onboard this person and help them be successful if they've said no to them? And maybe even part of it could be like, well, I'm going to show you this, that we didn't want to hire this person, so I'm not going to help them, it could be scenario, or else the person wasn't able to be successful at all in that team anyway, no matter what. Based on, whatever it was. So I would just convey the impact of this anti-pattern of behavior. And then if management really does want to override the team, then making that explicit with the team, and then sharing, like, I believe sharing with leadership at the same time. Like, I believe this will decrease their engagement in the team and decrease their buy-in, because they know you're just going to make the decision anyway. So why does it even go to the team? Why are we even trying to decide anyway, if you can just override our decision? This kind of thing happened in a previous company, and the VP who was overriding decisions decided to step back. It took some failures, but he did, based on this input and feedback, step back. So I wish you luck.
I will add too, we faced this as well, and we found there was a pattern, right, where a leader just persistently sort of felt like it was like they were the final gauge when in fact they weren't. And it sort of came to a head when a junior engineer was being hired, and the leader didn't feel like that was okay. The level of risk of hiring a junior engineer is pretty low, right? And so having somebody at the VP level get involved to say yay or nay on that, the way I sort of threw a label on that was, it's a nuclear option to have that leader make a decision. And I liked the title. I liked the label of nuclear option, because it sort of implies you should only do this in really dire situations when the risk is really high. And I think risk is a really good way to look at it as well. I don't know if that's helpful.
What about the alternative? What about when the guys all want to hire the person, the manager says no, and he says we'll hire them anyway, and it's your responsibility, and he gives the responsibility to the team for the decision they've now made?
I would say, to me, that's a good outcome, because the team really will want to make sure that the person is successful. And I think that the manager should then make explicit, I've got reservations, and if you own this decision, then you're responsible for making this person and helping them be successful in all ways, shapes, and forms based on this decision. And then, I would just say that and make sure it's explicitly clear.
I think in this instance, I was the manager, and also I put the decision down to the team, knowing full well within the interview how the guy responded, and I gave them the responsibility to make sure, and he still failed to come up to scratch and they realized very quickly afterwards, and they went, why did you let me hire him? And I said, so guys, it's your decision to hire him. You now
Right.
have to sit there and work with him to make sure he's either becomes part of the team or whatever. You can't just, we've got to do that whole thing.
Mm-hmm. So this is also a learning opportunity for them then, right? Maybe to trust your input a little bit more. And so yeah, it's all about the learning, right? I think no one can possibly be perfect all the time, but
no,
that's good learning.
I think it's really good. I think it's really good. One of the things I find is that the element of people's soft skills, where you talk about you've got to be a good facilitator, etc., like that, they are skills that people that people need to actually make mistakes. They need to use the facilitation by fail fast and learn quickly. And I think in lots of cases people are worried in that facilitation that they've got to do it right, they've got to do that. So the support mechanism is very important to allow those things to happen as well.
Yeah, my team and I thought about sharing this story earlier and I chose not to, but I'm going to now. We started hiring for a coach on my team in August, and we just last week made our offer. It took us that long to hire. And part of what we realized when we were about halfway through was that we were misaligned on what we were looking for. So if we go back to that boundary management, we took a step back and got aligned on what skills are must-haves, what are deal breakers, and what's coachable, right? Which then means obviously a must-have is that the candidate demonstrates being coachable. But this pattern, actually, not to like bring it back to the pattern, but I can't help it. It's like right there. This pattern can be really beneficial, just even with this conversation, taking a step back. Let's get explicit about our boundaries for making this decision and how we're generating input. It can be really, really helpful in these decisions. Cool. Anyone else want to share? All right. So I'm going to speak to these resources that we shared a little bit. If you have any additional resources, because there's tons of good ones out there, so feel free to like drop in the chat if you want to recommend to anybody else on here. And I am going to talk through them very briefly. In the early part of our talk, we talked about some traps. There's an article on HBR that goes through each of those traps and actually gives guidance on how you can avoid the trap. So I recommend checking that out. Heidi mentioned Open Leadership Network. The link is there. If you don't want to wait for the deck, openleadershipnetwork.com. Thinking in Bets. So this is a book I read some time ago. What I thought was really powerful here, and I wanted to make sure I kind of mentioned in this discussion, was that luck plays a role in our decisions. We have a tendency to think that a good outcome means that it was a good decision, and a bad outcome means it was a bad decision. But in fact, luck does play a role. It's not just about skill. So I just think that's a really powerful concept. There's some other stuff in that book that's really good as well. I mentioned Decisive. I just finished reading it. It's a good book in the sense that it does give a lot of practical techniques that you can use. And I think it goes quite well with the patterns that we shared today. And then the last thing, the 7 transformations of leadership, which is not actually about decision making. Earlier in the discussion, we talked about the sense making, right? The ways different people make sense of things. That article actually talks about this, it's action logic is the term that it uses, about how different people make sense of things. So I'm not suggesting you profile everybody on your team and figure out how they make sense of things, but it is really helpful to be aware of how different people might be perceiving the same information when you're going in to make a decision. And that might help you to be more explicit and avoid some of those assumptions or misunderstandings that get in the way of decision making. Cool, there's some great links on here as well.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing. Cool, so I have these Tibetan singing bowls here. One, because I love Tibetan singing bowls. And secondly, because we'd love to know what resonates and what doesn't. And then keep this time open for questions about the decision-making, open leadership network patterns, or anything else that you wanted to chat about in this session. So I am going to end the slide show and stop sharing my screen. Yeah, anything resonated, didn't resonate, more questions. We're here to answer your questions, both about open leadership and decision-making.
Heidi, I wonder
Just
if
a
you
big-
want to turn off the spotlight and then maybe it'll feel more like a group chatting. Thanks. Sorry to interrupt.
Ed?
Big thank you for sharing the information. Really useful.
Oh, glad it's useful. Thank you.
I found it really useful, and I have to be totally honest. I wasn't able to focus on this as much as I wanted to. I had to multitask a little bit, which is why my camera was off, but I still grabbed little pieces as we're in the organization I'm working in. We're looking at making a lot of decisions, and we're in the process of a transformation. I made little notes. I now have sticky notes up, and I look forward to watching the recording so I can close the gaps and get the pieces that I missed. So thank you so much for your time.
Great. You're very welcome.
Thank
Anne.
you.
Someone paste in the chat they'll be sharing with leadership team. Thank you. Go ahead.
So I was going to say there's a question here from John that actually is, I thought, an applicable question for right now, which said, any recommendation on how to get all team members' input, especially from quiet ones? So you're trying to empower, but you're not getting that input you want in the decisions.
Oh, that is a really awesome question. Kristen and I will tag team. She has more inputs than I do. And I'm going to start off by saying, have you asked them? Have you shared the need to get their input and made it very clear why we want their input? And then ask them how they prefer to give input. As one example, I had one team and they were all introverts and they all wanted to take, to Kristen's point earlier, every single person on the team wanted to think about things for a very long time. Even a check-in question they wanted to have in advance because they just didn't want to be surprised by the question. I can see some people smiling, and it was so true. And so it was like you queued up that decision or that that icebreaker question in advance, and you would send it to them. They would feel prepared. So yeah, I would ask them. Maybe they just need more time to make that decision. They might feel rushed. That's my one thought. I'm going to pass it to Kristen.
Yeah, I think so. There's no one size fits all, right? Because we're humans and we're all different. I do think like asking them also maybe what prevents them from chiming in, like if you're in a one-on-one or something, maybe they're afraid to sound stupid, or they think they have a different opinion or whatever. So maybe you can help work on it that way. I also think things like clean language and those sort of different techniques that get people looking at things and thinking about things more creatively can help. And then I will share, I mentioned earlier a team that I worked with where there was a one pager that went off to the tech lead, and the tech lead made all the decisions. So the way I actually kind of combated that was I asked the team to look in the backlog and in the top 50 items in their backlog, figure out which of those they had the most questions about or were most concerned about. And I had them put a card on a Trello board for that, and then brought them together for what we called an innovation session, because I'm not good at naming things, and had them vote on which of those topics they wanted to talk about. We put a topic into the talking column, and it turned out an RFC was already written for that. And the team came up with a much better solution by just starting to have a conversation. It was a faster build. It was easier to maintain. Like every aspect of it was better, and that went a huge way towards getting people to start contributing more as we moved forward. So that may not work for you. One size fits all doesn't actually work with humans, but just thinking outside the box and trying to tackle something a little differently might help.
I feel like liberating structures are also like really good to look into, right? For being able to give people a chance to speak up. Like we just did 1, 2, 4 all for our working agreement that, beginning of the year, good time to dust it off, right? Make sure it's current. And so like people think about an idea by themselves, then group of 2, group of 4, and then the whole team. So it gets people more comfortable to share, right? If it's like a room with 20 people, right, or a meeting with 20 people, I may not speak up, but if I start with my own thoughts and I have time to think about it, I think, Heidi, to your point about like giving people stuff in advance, giving them a chance to prepare, that's a good way to help people that are maybe more quiet.
Yeah, really good point.
Thank
I
you.
think also just setting the stage. I had a meeting that I held last couple weeks ago that I've done 4 times now in the last year, and we had over 100 people on the call, and it's meant to be a collaborative, let's poke holes in the things we're deciding meeting. And I found historically people had a tendency not to chime in, or the same few people did. So I kicked off the meeting by describing it as conversational, and you're not here to be a passive participant. We'd love to hear what you have to say. So I think even framing it in different ways can help too. Cool.
Awesome.
I've tried Agile games, different types of Agile games, to get someone that's very reserved to come out. For example, division of 3. As you go around the room, if your response is divided by 3, you're eliminated from the game. So it made it fun. Then another game that I use is Zip Zam Zoom, where you point at someone, they got to say the last word before you say it. So if I say zip, the other person has to say zoom, and then the other person that packs it off to the next person, they have to follow in line. And so I actually got the vice president, some executives to actually engage, because I like, if you're in a meeting, you're a team member.
That's
So
nice.
everyone engaged that way. So, and I did the airplane game where you actually had to do teamwork, and as teamwork to deliver products and services by building airplanes. Each person only had one fold, and they couldn't communicate, so they had to use nonverbal communication. So they brought it out where the people that were very conservative and reserved were no longer that shy, because they decided to be a part of the activities.
Yeah, that's actually really like one of the things that that is key, is to, if you get people to participate in activity and speak up early, then they'll often speak up in later on in the meeting. So if you have a meeting, try to get everybody speaking up in the beginning. One of the
Yes, the quietest person on the team. I thought the quietest person on the team was the most vocal person after going through these activities.
Yeah, I had a similar experience where one guy was like always negative Nancy, you know, like naysayer, and he would. I was like, okay, is he going to feel negative about this workshop? He won't speak up, and then no, he was like the most vocal person throughout the workshop. Yeah, cool. We've enjoyed our time here with you today. Please feel free to connect with us. Of course, Isaac has dropped the email. You can connect with us, coachingagilejourneys.com, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. We're all there. So any other questions? Oh.
I enjoyed it. I learned a lot.
Great.
Thank you for sharing. I appreciate that. That means a lot to us. The recording will be up on our site. And Isaac, last words?
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Heidi. And I do just want to point everybody to coachingagilejourneys.com. That's where you can find upcoming events. Right now we have Lean Coffee scheduled coming up next. This is where the recording will be. It'll be over on previous events. I also wanted to make you aware and put into the chat, I mentioned it earlier, we do have our 2020 end of year survey that's out. And so maybe someone could reshare that link in the chat while I'm sharing my screen here. Please do take that, because just as we learned today, decision-making really works best when you invite in opinions from other people. So that's what we're trying to do from our members, and you get things like this, right? Which topics most interest you? So we have great data that comes out of this, and this helps us in planning our 2021, what we're going to be focusing on. So take that survey. It closes on the 31st of January. So you've got a couple more days to take it. And then just as Heidi was saying, ways you can connect with us, definitely Coaching Agile Joe is our Twitter handle. We didn't have room for journeys, so we got in Coaching Agile Joe. That's as far as it got. And then LinkedIn, you can join us. We have a page where we post announcements. So things like upcoming event, we'll post those on our page. And then we have a group. If you want to have a conversation, you can join our group right there. So those are both Coaching Agile Journeys on LinkedIn. So join with us there. It's going to be a great year. We're expecting great things together, more more talks like this, that we're going to plan on having interactive and workshops this year based on what we've already heard so far from the survey. So we're very positive, looking forward to it. And Daniel Mezik's here. We're looking to see more partnership between CAJ and the OLN, the Open Leadership Network. This is such a rich experience, and these two groups really do connect well together with our synergies. So thank you everyone for participating today. And I just want to take a moment to say to Cristin and to Heidi, thank you guys so much for preparing this, bringing this talk to us right here at the beginning of the year, so we can have great decisions, hopefully increase our quality of our decisions throughout the year. So that's all I have to say. So thank you guys very much, and we'll hopefully see you at a future event. Well, thanks everybody.
Thanks.
Stay safe.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Bye
Bye,
everyone.
everybody.